Right, so it takes a special kind of genius to turn the head of Israel's cyber defense into the poster boy for child predator stings in Las Vegas, and an even darker genius to then let him walk free on a $10,000 bail bond and a one-way ticket back to Tel Aviv. Tom Artiom Alexandrovich wasn't supposed to end up in handcuffs, you see. Yet when he did, the American justice system seemed to break its own spine, bending backwards to ensure he slipped away. It doesn't hurt when the federal prosecutor also happens to be Israeli as well, I suppose. What has happened here was not a scandal in isolation, though, but just the latest example of Israeli impunity in the face of justice. Federal charges mysteriously getting dropped, the Israeli-born US attorney declining to prosecute, intelligence meetings that raise more questions than answers, and a leaked ledger showing Israel has buried literally thousands of international extradition requests on the most serious of crimes. If you wanted a case study in how to turn justice into an absolute, you couldn't script it better than how Israel has been treated and considers itself, as far as extradition goes in this example at least, as above the law. Right, so Tom Artiom Alexandrovich, the executive director of Israel's National Cyber Directorate and a recipient of the prestigious Israel Defense Prize back in 2021, no less. He was arrested in Las Vegas, of course, after an undercover police operation exposed his attempts to solicit sex from a 15-year-old girl. According to law enforcement, Alexandrovich had arranged to meet a girl he believed to be underage, had promised to buy her a ticket to a Cirque du Soleil show, and had planned to bring a condom. Instead, he was met by police officers who took him deservedly into custody. On paper, the case should have been perfectly straightforward, therefore, shouldn't it? He was banged to rights in a police sting, wasn't he? Federal law in the United States, particularly Section 2422B of Title 18 of the US Code, explicitly criminalizes the use of the internet to entice or attempt to entice a minor into sexual activity. This statute carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years in prison. In countless other cases involving sting operations, the Department of Justice has pursued federal charges under this provision, often with swift and heavy sentences for offenders. Yet in this instance, something very different happened, didn't it? Alexandrovich was charged not federally, but under Nevada state law, with the far less severe crime of luring a minor via computer. He was released almost immediately on a bail of just $10,000, faced no restrictions on his travel, and therefore very quickly returned to Israel. His scheduled court date is August 27th. If he shows up, I'll frankly eat my shorts, because he is already beyond the reach of Nevada authorities now. The sense of outrage that has followed has not been confined to activists or even opposition politicians. Even mainstream media outlets in the US noted that the decision to release Alexandrovich under such conditions was extraordinary. It was unthinkable, given that he was a foreign national with no US ties and every incentive to flee. When combined with the revelation that he had met with senior US intelligence agencies, including the FBI, Department of Homeland Security, and the NSA in the hours before his release, the entire episode appeared less like a failure of procedure and more like the deliberate construction of an escape corridor. The guiding question is quite simple, therefore. What does this case say about Israel, about its commitment to international law, and about the protection it extends to its own citizens, even in cases of the most egregious crimes? Alexandrovich's arrest on the 6th of August was the result of a routine sting operation. Law enforcement agents in Nevada's Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force had been posing as an underage girl online. When Alexandrovich contacted the supposed teenager and arranged a meeting, police moved in. Such operations are sadly common, but the statutory framework for prosecuting them is therefore very well established. Federal law does not require an actual minor to be present. The attempt itself is sufficient. The arrest was therefore exactly the kind of case for which Section 2422B exists. Yet when the charges were filed, they were not federal but state level. The Clark County District Attorney brought the case, carrying a maximum of 10 years but no mandatory minimum, a significant downgrade from federal exposure. Why was that then? The official explanation offered was simply that the local DA had taken responsibility for the case. But critics pointed out that federal agencies had been directly involved in this sting. The FBI were involved, Homeland Security investigations were involved, and other federal bodies besides had worked alongside local officers. It was unusual, if not unprecedented, for such a case to be handled exclusively at the state level when federal jurisdiction here was obvious. Once the case was in state court, the stage was set for a lenient outcome. Bail was set at $10,000, an amount that would be absolutely trivial for someone of Alexandrovich's standing. There was no requirement that he surrender his passport, no order preventing him from leaving the United States, no electronic monitoring. The Clark County DA later insisted that this was standard procedure for the charge in question. Yet standard cannot reasonably apply to a senior foreign official with the resources and motivation to flee the country at the drop of a hat, as he did. As Al Jazeera noted in its coverage, the decision practically guaranteed that Alexandrovich would abscond. And abscond he did, boarding a plane and returning to Israel. The escape corridor was thus complete, federal prosecution foregone, bail conditions minimised, and no safeguards imposed. To describe this as a procedural failure is frankly too generous, isn't it? It was a sequence of choices, each of which tilted the system towards impunity. And at the centre of those choices was Sigal Chassa, the acting US Attorney for Nevada, appointed on April 1st of this year. It was not a joke, unfortunately. Chassa is an Israeli-born lawyer with a record of political partisanship. In her official statement after Alexandrovich's arrest, she confirmed that the prosecution would be left to the Clark County DA. She offered no explanation for why federal charges would not be pursued, despite the clear applicability of federal law. The optics are now even more disastrous than before, therefore. Here was an Israeli-born US attorney declining to prosecute a senior Israeli official under federal statutes, handing the case instead to a local office with weaker tools and less leverage. So critics immediately, and rightly, questioned whether this constituted a conflict of interest. Al-Mayadeen described the decision as fueling concerns of bias. That's a little bit polite. The Quds News Network characterised it bluntly as an Israeli-born official refusing to prosecute one of her own. Press TV went even further. They alleged that the Trump administration itself had intervened to ensure Alexandrovich's release, prioritising the protection of Netanyahu's cyber chief over the demands of justice. Whether or not political orders were issued from above or not, the perception of impropriety is clear for all to see. In any comparable situation, an official with potential conflict would be expected to recuse themselves. A neutral US attorney from another district or the criminal division at Main Justice in Washington could have taken this case instead. Instead, Chassa's office exercised discretion in a manner that directly benefited Alexandrovich. The bail decision deserves close scrutiny as well. For an ordinary defendant accused of a serious felony but with ties to the local community, bail at $10,000 might well be standard. But Alexandrovich was no ordinary defendant. He was a senior foreign official accused of a crime carrying potentially a decade or more in prison with the wealth and connections to ensure immediate escape. To grant bail in such circumstances without conditions was mad. In most cases involving foreign nationals, especially those accused of crimes against children, courts impose strict conditions. Passports get surrendered, defendants are placed under house arrest or electronic monitoring, travel is restricted to the jurisdiction of the court. The logic is quite straightforward to that. The risk of flight is high and the incentives to flee are strong. Yet in Alexandrovich's case, none of these safeguards were applied. The DA's insistence that it was standard only underscores the problem. To treat this case as standard was to ignore the exceptional circumstances of it. And the result was all too predictable. Alexandrovich left the country, and I very much doubt he will be returning. But one of the most troubling revelations came not from the courtroom, but from investigative reporting. It was revealed that Alexandrovich met with senior US intelligence agencies, the FBI, Homeland Security, NSA, all shortly before his release. The content of those meetings has not been disclosed, of course, but their timing is very suspicious, isn't it? The suggestion is that Alexandrovich may have offered information or cooperation in exchange for leniency. As head of Israel's Cyber Defense Division, he would have had intimate knowledge of Israel's intelligence operations, many of which are closely intertwined with US agencies. If the US allowed him to slip away in order to preserve intelligence cooperation or avoid diplomatic fallout, it represents a chilling calculation. The protection of strategic alliances placed above the pursuit of justice, even for crimes against children. The truth of what was discussed in those meetings probably will never be revealed. That deliberate absence of clarity deepens the suspicion that justice was sacrificed behind closed doors, though. The refusal to prosecute federally is even more remarkable when considering it all in light of the statutory framework. Section 2422B of Title 18 is very explicit. It criminalises any attempt to persuade, to induce, to entice or coerce any minor to engage in sexual activity using facilities of interstate commerce. The internet is the quintessential facility of interstate commerce. Attempts are covered as thoroughly as completed acts. The penalty is severe, at mandatory minimum of 10 years in prison. This statute has been the backbone of federal prosecutions in child exploitation stings for decades now. Hundreds of offenders are prosecuted under it every year. In many cases, the evidence is weaker than that presented in Alexandrovich's case. Yet those defendants face the full weight of federal justice. The fact that Alexandrovich did not is inexplicable in legal terms. The only explanation that makes any sense here is political or discretionary, and in either case, it's a failure of justice. Alexandrovich's return to Israel raises the question of extradition, though. Would Israel return him to face justice in Nevada? Well, precedent suggests not. Israel's record on extradition is long and very troubled, marked by delays and obstructions and just plain outright refusals. The most famous precedent is the Scheinbein affair. In 1997, Samuel Scheinbein, a teenager from Maryland, murdered another young man and fled to Israel. Israel's Supreme Court initially ruled that he could not be extradited, citing his Jewish heritage as a basis for Israeli citizenship. The US was outraged over this, and the case strained diplomatic relations at the time. Only after prolonged negotiations did Israel agree to try Scheinbein domestically. The episode forced a reform of Israeli extradition law, but the underlying reluctance to surrender its citizens remained. Another notorious case is that of Avraham Mondrovitz, a Brooklyn school counselor accused of molesting dozens of boys. He fled to Israel in 1984 and lived openly in Jerusalem for decades. Despite repeated US requests, Israel refused to extradite him, citing legal technicalities. A 2012 New York Post article summarized the situation bluntly. Mondrovitz got away with it. Survivors are left without justice. The case of Malka Leifer further illustrates the problem. An ultra-Orthodox school principal accused of abusing multiple girls in Australia. Leifer fled to Israel in 2008. For more than a decade, her extradition was delayed by endless psychiatric evaluations and appeals. It was only in 2021 that she was finally extradited. And in 2023, she was sentenced to 15 years in prison in Australia. But the years of delay inflicted additional trauma on her victims, who campaigned tirelessly for justice. Michael Ron David Kedar, the Israeli-American teenager behind thousands of bomb threats against Jewish institutions in the United States. He was tried and sentenced in Israel rather than extradited. So again, the pattern is clear. Israel prefers to deal with its citizens domestically, if at all, rather than surrender them to foreign jurisdictions. An abuse of Israel's citizenship law is too easy, it seems. In each case, justice was delayed, obstructed, or denied. Alexandrovich's case is therefore unlikely to result in extradition. Israel's past behaviour suggests it will shield him from facing trial abroad, perhaps promising instead to investigate him domestically. Yet history shows such promises are rarely fulfilled. The bitter irony is that Israel's top cyber defender has now become its most notorious fugitive from justice. A reversal that frankly speaks volumes about their legal double standards, doesn't it? But now things have just got even worse for Israel. The scandal has deepened with the release of leaked documents from Israel's Ministry of Justice. Oh dear, oh dear. The leak revealed that over 2,150 international legal requests have been ignored or delayed. Among them were multiple extradition requests involving child sex abuse suspects. This revelation confirmed what critics have long suspected, therefore, that obstruction is not accidental when it comes to Israel, but it is systemic. The Ministry of Justice had effectively created a bureaucratic graveyard of requests, delaying or ignoring them until they were no longer viable. Each delay request represents a victim denied justice, seemingly because Israel doesn't answer to the same laws as the rest of we mere mortals. The sheer scale of the numbers, more than 2,000 cases, demonstrates that this is not about isolated failures, but about institutionalized policy. The leak thus cast Alexandrovich's case in an all-new and even darker light, if that isn't a contradiction in terms. His escape was not a fluke. It was the predictable outcome of a system designed to protect Israeli nationals from accountability abroad. The Alexandrovich affair, when combined with Israel's history and the revelations of the leak, says something profound about the state approach to justice. It reveals a culture of impunity for the powerful, where senior officials can expect protection even in cases involving crimes against children. It reveals obstruction as policy with thousands of international requests buried in bureaucracy. It exposes selective sovereignty, where Israel demands that its own legal orders be respected abroad while denying reciprocity to other states. It shows how bureaucracy can be weaponized with endless delays and legal maneuvers serving as shields for the accused. And it demonstrates the erosion of Israel's moral legitimacy, whatever is left of that now anyway. A state that obstructs justice on this scale cannot credibly present itself as a democracy under the rule of law. At every stage there were opportunities to prevent Alexandrovich's escape. Federal prosecutors should have filed charges under Section 2422B, ensuring a mandatory minimum and federal oversight. Bail should have been denied, or at the very least conditioned on passport surrender and electronic monitoring. If Alexandrovich fled, the Department of Justice and State Department should have immediately filed a provisional arrest request with Israel. Israel should have honoured its extradition obligations, or failing that, prosecuted Alexandrovich domestically without delay. International partners should have pressed for compliance, tying legal cooperation to reciprocity. None of these steps were taken. Instead, every safeguard was bypassed and Alexandrovich has walked free. The Alexandrovich affair is not simply about one man's alleged crime. It is about the exposure of a system here. From the courtroom in Nevada to the Ministry of Justice in Jerusalem, the trail of decisions and delays reveals a state that shields its own from accountability. The scandal exposes not just legal failure, but moral failure. Crimes against children are amongst the worst in any society. They sicken us. When we consider what Israel had done in Gaza to children, though, should we be that surprised here? To obstruct justice in such cases is to compound the harm already done, though. By allowing Alexandrovich to escape, by burying more than 2,000 international requests, Israel has demonstrated that it values the protection of its own officials, its own citizens, over the pursuit of justice for victims. So if you smelt a rat in this case, you're far from alone. The rat is not Alexandrovich alone, though. The rat is the system that let him walk free, and until that system is confronted, every survivor left without justice will smell the same stench of impunity. On the global stage, though, Israel has been handed even more evidence to a court that will prosecute given half a chance, that being the ICC. You see, Benjamin Netanyahu has threatened to turn Gaza into Dresden, an historical should-never-have-happened event in which helped shape the formation of the Geneva Conventions themselves as it happens. But as Netanyahu sends the tanks and ground forces in to pound Gaza City to dust, he's missed the fact that even before his final push, he'd already done so much worse than Dresden to Gaza. Get all the details of that story in this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, sort of spreading the word and helping support the channel at the very same time, which is very much appreciated, holding power to account for ordinary working class people, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.